Good morning, everybody. Let's try that again. Happy Independence Day, everybody. Come on. So just a couple quick announcements for everybody. You'll see in front of you on all your chairs, if you don't have one, there are probably extras here in the room. You'll see a passport and a ticket for this afternoon's excursions, and you'll definitely want to follow the instructions because if you do, there's an opportunity to win a free pass to next year's conference. So we have a lot of, yes, please. So we have a lot of really exciting events today to celebrate Independence Day. Right after this talk, we will be having a book signing right out here in the foyer. That'll be at 11:45 right after the talk. And tonight, we have our Independence Day reception. That'll be in this room, just to be clear. So you'll come up to this room. We have a reception right out here, and then we'll come in here for our concert and our celebration of America's independence. So we're streaming this live here from Boston at OCON 2025, and I want to just introduce our web audience, people joining us from around the world. So whether you're here in the room or you're joining us online, I want to just tell you about a special opportunity because we try to do something special every year for Independence Day. You can go to aynrand.org/revolution, where you can make a one-time donation of $17.76 to celebrate America. Thank you. And if you want to, move the decimal place over too, I don't think anybody will mind, right? Okay, but you didn't come here to hear me speak. I have now the distinct honor to introduce our speaker today, someone is a very dear mentor to me. Everybody give it up for ARI Fellow and Director of Content, Ben Baer.
Happy Independence Day, everybody. 5 years ago, my wife and I were sitting in our locked-down apartment in Santa Ana, California, and the one enjoyable thing we were able to get out of that experience was looking out over our patio, seeing a display of illegal fireworks over the entire neighborhood, a subtle act of defiance. But it wasn't quite as enjoyable as the experience 1 year subsequent to that, when we had moved to Austin, Texas, and we joined a large group of our Objectivist friends, auditorium shores, to watch the fireworks over beautiful Austin skyline. The experience of freedom was palpable. I'm going to come back to the COVID lockdowns later today. Someday I hope you can join us in Texas, where I know that if you do, we can make it even freer. But we can do it only if we know what we are up against. And part of that means knowing we need more than just political independence. What more do we need? Ayn Rand had something to say about this. The beginning of, or rather in her essay in 1961 for The New Intellectual, she said, "The world crisis of today is a moral crisis, and nothing less than a moral revolution can resolve it. A moral revolution to sanction and complete the political achievement of the American Revolution." What does that mean? What does it mean to have a moral revolution? Part of it, especially the sanctioning part, is what we've talked about a fair amount at this conference already. Ankar's talk about the Enlightenment. We know the Enlightenment failed to offer and defend a rational code of morality, an alternative to the primitive, tribalistic morality of self-sacrifice. So we know that we need new intellectuals who will come forward to defend that alternative, an alternative of the morality of life, of self-interest, of the pursuit of happiness. And incidentally, I should mention, if you haven't yet read Ankar Gatte's talk, Atlas Shrugged, America's second Declaration of Independence. It's contained in that Prophet Without Apology book that you all got a copy of. Nobody does a better job explaining why the morality of self-interest is the one that sanctions the achievement of the political revolution of America better than what Ankar did in that essay. But what I want to focus on today is something a little bit different. Not just the sanctioning of that political achievement, but the completion of it. It's not going to be enough just to make a formal declaration, or even to convince other people to make a formal declaration of a new morality, because there's more at stake here. There's more that we're up against than just the explicit commitments. And a clue to that can be seen in the very next passage, because Ayn Rand says, evasions, equivocations, and guilty apologies will not work any longer. What evasions is she talking about? What guilty apologies? Who is making them? Why? And why does she think that a moral revolution is necessary as an alternative to those evasions? Well, that is something we are going to spend some time talking about today. And to get you to think about it, I want to go back to that issue of COVID lockdowns. It's a case study I'm going to dig into today. Ankar talked a little bit about it earlier. It's going to be a case study I developed today. There's a lot of questions to ask about how these things could happen in America. But especially I want you to think about, why were there Republican COVID lockdowns? Now you can of course ask the same question, why were there ones in Democratic states? But the Republican Party, they're the ones who are supposed to be, or at least one time thought of themselves as the defenders of America, of individualism, of freedom. And yes, in Republican states, the lockdowns lifted somewhat earlier, but the fact that they happened at all should raise eyebrows. How is it that the party that thinks of itself as the party of freedom ends up taking its cues and its marching orders from a policy originally adopted in communist China? That's a question we need to think about, especially given the fact we know the Republican Party has been tilting further to the left, further in the direction of ending economic freedom, increasing statism, collectivism, economic nationalism. A related question we want to ask in addition to this one is, why is it that even as the right and the left become so similar to each other, there's still so much hostility between them? Why does the right resent the left so much, even though they have the same, or are coming to have the same basic political philosophy? When I talk about the right and the left today, I am talking about just sociological terms to name the two competing political tribes in this country. And it's important that that's all they really are, tribes. The differences they have amount to tribalistic differences over tribalistic totems, cultural controversies like gender, like immigration, like vaccines. Nobody, however, debates anymore the big questions of political philosophy. What's the proper role of government? What is the relationship between the individual and the state? So how is it possible that there is this hostility of the right toward the left, even though there's increasing agreement over basic philosophical questions? Well, here is the basic answer to that question I am going to propose today. Some of it will seem familiar to you probably, but some of it may be new. The first reason I think there is this phenomenon is that, yes, Americans, left and right, they share a common morality. I even say, and this is going to be a concept I return to, they're psychologically dependent on a common morality, the one that we need the revolution against, the morality of self-sacrifice. But importantly, not all of them want to admit it, that they share this common morality. Of course, the left is the one that is the more consistently explicit about its devotion to altruistic morality. The right, on the other hand, holds a contradiction. On the one hand, it holds on to the fumes, the remnants of Americanism, of some kind of respect for the pursuit of happiness. But on the other hand, of course, its commitment to Judeo-Christian religion makes it committed to the same morality of self-sacrifice that also empowers the left, but which the left just takes more consistently. So the left is more consistent, and on some level, I think the right knows that. They don't want to admit it. That's what generates evasion, defensiveness, resentment, hostility. That psychological phenomenon, that evasive dependence, that is what we are really up against. That is what we need a full revolution against. And I'm going to talk about that today and try to illustrate it by using the case study of the COVID lockdowns that I mentioned before. But in analyzing those examples, what I want to help do is to bring to the surface, I think, underappreciated material from Ayn Rand on understanding the psychology involved in how people evade their own reliance on altruism. This is largely material that we find in Galt's speech, a text which I think continues to be underappreciated and understudied, even by Ayn Rand's biggest fans. When you do it, you realize just how true it is that Atlas Shrugged is a declaration of independence, a second declaration of independence, and not just because of the way it offers that positive moral alternative, but also because of the way it has a deep understanding of the psychology of what we are up against. So let's start by understanding how all of this expresses itself in our culture and our politics today, looking at, again, this COVID case study. If you rewind to 5 years ago, if you think about it, the COVID pandemic was an altruist's dream. Why? Well, because the virus's particular nature was such that it targeted the sick, the old, the immunocompromised, did not so much target the young, the healthy. And so it was so easy for altruists waiting in the wings to say, you young, productive people who want to go out, who want to work, who want to be educated, who want to travel, how dare you when unknowingly you might spread that virus that will target those previously mentioned vulnerable people. That's exactly, of course, what the lockdowns did. They sacrificed the young and the healthy to the old and the sick. Now, I want to be very clear about my position on the lockdowns and what I take to be the Institute's position. And that is, first of all, that it is absolutely true that the COVID virus was a serious medical threat, one that free individuals had very good, rational, selfish reasons to want to take personal, private action against. You were free if you wanted to stay home, to try to protect yourself. You had good reason, if only to protect your health. You had good reason to want to protect the health of loved ones who were vulnerable. That's a selfish reason. Not only that, here's something that came up in Dr. Adolja's talk yesterday. There is, in fact, a proper role for government in cases of pandemics and infectious disease. Ayn Rand herself thought government could properly quarantine people when there's a provable, known, specific, demonstrable, objective, infectious threat of a sufficient severity. But nothing about any of that would justify the sweeping national and statewide lockdowns that were imposed on us 5 years ago, beginning in China, moving to the West. If you want to understand more about this issue, I highly recommend, if you've forgotten about it, checking out Ankar Gatte's paper, A Pro-Freedom Approach to Infectious Disease. There's nothing about the proper role of government that can justify those lockdowns. They can only be justified on altruistic grounds, on the grounds of a philosophy that has no basis for respecting the rights of individuals, no basis for recognizing our need to be able to be responsible for our own health and the happiness of our loved ones. And so, of course, it was altruistic reasons that were given to justify these lockdowns. Obviously, it started with democratic states. Here's Gavin Newsom. I remember him giving this press conference live in the middle of March 19th, and he tells us, a state as large as ours is many parts. But at the end of the day, we're one body. There's a mutuality. There's a recognition of our interdependence. And therefore, he says, we need to love one another and be locked down. Same thing, Andrew Cuomo, just a day later, when he announces his lockdown at his press conference, he says, I want to be able to say, I did everything we could do. If everything we do saves just one life, I'll be happy. If I shut down businesses, if I put people out of business, if I make them bankrupt, if I cause them to lose years of education, it's all worth it if I save just one life. Andrew Cuomo doubled down, by the way. Just half a year later, he writes a book which would have been his campaign book, American Crisis, where he explains why he did what he did. He says, I was raised at a kitchen table where my father talked about improving society. In the teachings of Matthew 25, building community, dedicated to doing justice and improving life for all. Matthew 25, of course, is the passage about how whatever you do to the least among us, you have done to me. And of course, it's not an accident that even Democrats are citing religious scripture in order to justify their altruism. Ultimately, it's religion that is the home, the source of the morality of self-sacrifice. But I hasten to remind you, because not everyone remembers, that it was not just the Democrats. 19 Republican governors imposed these lockdowns, whether in the form of shelter-in-place orders, stay-at-home orders, or various business shutdown orders. Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida, you may remember, who later on during the campaign of 2024 tried to portray himself as the big COVID rebel, locked down Florida from April 1st all the way until September 25th of 2020. And it wasn't just that they imposed some kind of order. It's that they were nearly as stringent, not quite, but nearly as stringent as those imposed by the Democratic governors. The other day in Ankar's lecture, he talked about how there had been so little reflection on what happened during COVID in our culture. I will point you to what I think is a partial exception to that, this new book that just came out by Stephen Macedo and Francis Lee in COVID's Wake, How Our Politics Failed Us. It's not a perfect book. It's probably too conventional, too utilitarian, saying we didn't do enough to think about costs versus benefits. But in the course of reading it, you come across very interesting facts, such as this chart, which the authors assembled using data from Oxford University, which had assembled a kind of stringency index for measuring government response, factoring in to what extent different governments, including state governments in the United States, had various shutdown orders, travel restrictions, event closures, travel restrictions, etc. And if you look at this chart, you see on the top there's a dotted line, on the bottom there's a solid line. And it goes through time through the course of the pandemic. And yes, the top line with the dotted line, that's the line of the Democratic states. The bottom line, the solid line, is the GOP Republican states. But you'll notice there's not that much of a difference, especially at the very beginning of the pandemic, where the Republican states score in the mid-70s out of 100 in stringency, the Democrats in the low 80s, not that much difference. And there's some departure along the way, though they come back together at the end, because actually, even though in Republican states lockdowns were removed, they were sometimes put back. So it's not just that they did it. They were encouraged to do it by the Republican president at the time, Donald Trump. You don't remember this perhaps, but on March 16th, he releases guidance, the president's coronavirus recommendations, where in the fine print, you read, governors of states with evidence of community transmission should close schools, bars, restaurants, food courts, gyms, and other indoor and outdoor venues where groups of people congregate. They should be closed. That's the advice, that's the guidance coming from President Trump. And it wasn't only that. You may remember at one point, Georgia decided to open a little bit early. Magazines like The Atlantic called it Georgia's experiment in human sacrifice. President Trump seemed to agree because on April 23rd, he disagreed strongly with that decision, said it was too soon. A little bit later that month, he criticizes Sweden for not having lockdown at all. And don't forget that President Trump and the Republicans in Congress at this time had no trouble at all setting up what was basically a temporary European-style welfare state in order to help make up for the various burdens they had imposed with their lockdowns through all kinds of cash transfer payments. It wasn't just that Trump gave this guidance from President Trump was cited by the Republican governors when they did their lockdown orders. Here's Ron DeSantis on April 1st saying, the president just announced this extension. I take this as a sign that it's effectively a national pause. Therefore, I am going to lock down Floridians. When the Republican governors give their press conferences announcing the lockdowns, they use the exact same altruistic talking points that the Republicans use. Here's Governor Greg Abbott of Texas. In his press conference on March 31st, he says, together we will heal our state. He brings up Texas Speaker of the House, also a Republican, who says, we're all in this together, the number one altruistic bromide of the lockdown. In Alabama, deep south, deep red Alabama, Governor Kay Ivey, when she has her press conference announcing lockdowns on April 3rd, brings to the stage a preacher to tell us that we need to do the lockdown because we have love that surpasses all understanding. And the Lord orders you to stay home and to give up going out for Lent. I am not making this up. Now, I do want to emphasize, I don't think many of these governors did this very enthusiastically. Not even many of the Democrats. I mean, all the way until March 17th, Andrew Cuomo in New York was saying there's not going to be a shutdown, there's not going to be a quarantine. But I think eventually they were shamed into changing their mind. The Republican governors were certainly shamed into reversing their policy. And shame is something that works only if you share the moral premise of those people at the Atlantic, calling it an experiment of human sacrifice, doing the shaming, because you're afraid that it's going to look like you've violated the values that the shamers have in common with you. But why did the shame suddenly work? Why did the Republicans suddenly default to these altruistic premises that they did in fact share with the Democrats? As best as I can tell from studying the history, basically everybody panicked. There were a couple of precipitants to this panic. One was in late February, the WHO goes to China, where it all started. And the Chinese give them data saying that the draconian lockdowns that were being used in China were working, were bringing down the rate of transmission. The WHO started to announce they thought this would work. Now, why anybody should believe data coming from the authoritarian Chinese is a very good question. Why anyone should think, even if the data is true, we should follow their model, which sometimes included welding people into their apartment buildings, is another good question. The second thing that I think precipitated the panic was in the middle of March, Imperial College, you may remember, released a computer model report predicting there would be 2 million deaths in the United States if nothing was done. This report was instrumental in convincing Boris Johnson in the UK to do a lockdown, a national lockdown there. It was instrumental in the US. Deborah Birx showed the report to President Trump. Once she did that, that's when he issued his guidance. And part of how you can tell that this really was just panic, and this came up also in Ankar's talk, was that they abandoned the plans they already had in place for how to deal with the pandemic. Major organizations respected by Democrats had just in 2019 published plans about how to deal with a global pandemic, especially a respiratory pandemic. The WHO said, in the case of a respiratory pandemic, which is by its nature very hard to contain, lockdowns, travel restrictions, quarantines are not to be used in any circumstances, said the WHO. Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security said they are the least likely to be effective. They even warned governors who might be tempted to panic to impose the lockdowns just so it could look like they were doing something. They warned them against doing that. Unfortunately, don't panic is the advice nobody ever wants to take when they're panicking. Turns out even Dr. Fauci was critical of the lockdown model, critical of China's lockdown model, up until the end of January. They panicked. What I think this helps demonstrate is just how deeply psychologically entrenched altruistic premises are in our culture with Democrats and Republicans alike. Because how you act in a crisis, how you act when it's an emergency, when the chips are down, that's what reveals your basic operating premises. Now, of course, it was easier for the left to do because they're so much more explicit and consistent with their altruism. But yes, even the allegedly, ostensibly pro-America, pro-freedom Republicans ended up taking marching orders basically from communist China. So what happens when people who think of themselves or portray themselves as defenders of the home of the brave and of the pursuit of happiness end up being shamed into compliance with the basic moral premises of the virtues of renunciation and humiliation? What happens in their mind? Well, to think about that, we now need to turn to understanding something about the moral psychology involved here. And this is where Ayn Rand has something important to tell us about why an entrenched dependence on altruism generates a kind of evasion and hostility and defensiveness and resentment. Now, anytime you want to talk about Ayn Rand's moral psychology, you should first put on the table the value at stake, the most important value at stake. What's the most important value psychologically, according to Ayn Rand? Self-esteem. What does Ayn Rand say about self-esteem? Everybody needs it. Everybody. And I'll come back to why that's important in a minute. She explains why everybody needs it in the following passage from Galt's speech in Atlas Shrugged. She says, "Man knows that his desperate need of self-esteem is a matter of life or death. As a being of volitional consciousness, he knows he must know his own value in order to maintain his own life. He knows that he has to be right. To be wrong in action means danger to his life. To be wrong in person, to be evil, means to be unfit for existence." Self-esteem for Ayn Rand, of course, is the basic commitment that one is able to live and one is worthy of living. And it's important that it's worthy by a standard of morality. You need to believe that you are good if you are going to continue to motivate your action. As she points out, we are volitional beings. We have to make choices. Our choices need to be motivated. We need to think they're good to actually implement them. This need for self-esteem is so important that she places the value of self-esteem as one of the cardinal values in her system of ethics, a point which is central to her defense of a morality of self-interest against the morality of altruism and self-sacrifice. It's central to showing what her alternative is, that self-interest is not that caricature that altruists make of it, that self-interest is not the actions of that unthinking, emotion-driven predator that they imagine the selfish person to be, that instead, self-interest means the pursuit of both material and spiritual values, like self-esteem, values that you seek in the long term, values that you seek that are part of your nature as a rational being, a reflective being. Now, importantly, self-esteem is a value that you have to pursue and achieve. You pursue it through virtuous action. If you do, you earn self-esteem. You convince yourself, I actually am a good person. I've proved it. And so even though everybody needs self-esteem, it's very important for our case today that not everybody gets it. Not everybody does the things they need to earn it. But they sure do still need it. And that is important for understanding why I am bringing up the issue of the need for self-esteem in order to understand why people evade their reliance on altruism. It helps explain it. Understanding why everyone needs self-esteem, they need to believe themselves to be good, helps us understand why they don't want to acknowledge they are relying on altruism. I think of self-esteem as a bit like, to use a very crude analogy, food for the soul. And just like with food, if you can't get the good stuff, if you can't get healthy food, you'll use junk food. Same thing with self-esteem. If you can't get or don't choose to get real self-esteem, you'll get or go for junk self-esteem. You'll say, I'm a good person because I sacrifice myself. I use this junk moral code. But of course, unlike junk food, which you can eat blissfully all day, knowing it's junk, and still get a little bit of nutritious value. It doesn't work that way with junk self-esteem. If all you're getting is junk self-esteem, you cannot acknowledge that it is junk self-esteem, that your code is a junk moral code, because then you won't believe that what you're doing is good. But that's what you need. To see this, to understand why the need for self-esteem is so important in explaining people's evasive behavior, it's good to take a look at where that passage I just read from Galt's speech actually comes up in the speech. This is underappreciated. I want to give you a quick and dirty, high-level outline of all of Galt's speech. It, of course, starts by observing that the world is in a moral crisis. It's in a crisis because of the code of morality that it's accepted. If we want to get out of it, we need to rediscover morality, a rational code of morality, which then Galt presents. At the beginning, his positive alternative view. It's not in that section where he talks about why we need self-esteem, even though, of course, self-esteem is a cardinal value. Where does it come up? In the next section, he talks about the morality of death, the alternative that he's opposing. He talks about how the morality of death, altruistic self-sacrifice, is not a morality of love. It is a morality calling for sacrifice for its own sake, a worship of the zero. He then talks about the evil of the preachers of the morality of death, how they are people who are afraid of the consciousness of others, how they're afraid of independence, how they hate people who are themselves independent. And therefore they preach altruism, because if you can get others to accept this code on faith and obey you, then the fact that you yourself weren't independent is no longer so threatening. Nobody else is being independent. Look how obedient they are to me. It helps those preachers fake their self-esteem. But then, most importantly, the section I want to spend a little more time on, the final section of Galt's speech, is where he turns from condemning the preachers, the evil preachers of the morality of death, to the better people in the world, to the people who he characterizes as those of you who still retain a remnant of the dignity and will to love one's life. I am offering the chance to make a choice. And he says the following things about them. He says, you half-practice their code, believing it good, while cheating on it guiltily. And you have to evade the fact that the looters are the more consistent practitioners of this code. You do it because of your need for self-esteem. That's where the passage that I read before comes up in the speech. It comes up in order to explain why the better people have to evade their reliance on this code. And of course, then only if you repudiate it can we rebuild America on the basis of renewed self-esteem. Let me drill down a little bit more into his own explanation of why this evasion happens. Galt says, you blank it out. Here he's saying you blank out the fact that the looters themselves come from a religious morality, in order to blank out the knowledge that the looters have a stranglehold upon you, which consists of your moral code that the looters are the final and consistent practitioners of the morality you're half obeying, half evading, that they practice it the only way it can be practiced, by turning the earth into a sacrificial furnace, that your morality forbids you to oppose them in the only way they can be opposed, by refusing to become a sacrificial animal and proudly asserting your right to exist. You blank it out because your self-esteem is tied to that mystic unselfishness, which you've never possessed or practiced but spent many years pretending to possess, that the thought of denouncing it fills you with terror. And if you think about it, yeah, if you thought that something you took to be your own cherished value, which when practiced it consistently in the world was turning it into hell, you wouldn't want to acknowledge that was your code. It's here in the speech, immediately after this paragraph, that paragraph about the need for self-esteem comes up. He's telling us that we need it, and the fact that we need it explains why people even do this kind of irrational evasion. Well, who in our world today are the looters who are the more consistent practitioners of this code of self-sacrifice? Who today are the ones who half obey, half evade, are threatened by the very idea of denouncing the code that they hold dear? We'll come back to that in a moment. But first, just to really clarify what I think he's saying is the source of evasion here, I made a little chart. The people who half obey, half cheat, what that tells you is they're holding a contradiction. What's the contradiction? Well, to whatever extent anyone accepts altruism and is still alive to talk about it, because you can't live consistently, they have to hold the following kind of contradiction. On the one hand, they think to themselves, I'm good because I practice this morality. I'm good because I'm negating myself. That's what you get from simply accepting the code. But the other thing that they have to believe, which they get from reality, is, well, how can a thing that you negate be so good? If you're negating yourself, how could yourself be any good? And so then, how could you think of yourself as actually good because of it? That's a contradiction. And you can't maintain that consciously. You can't believe a contradiction consciously. And so to continue to hold on to it, you have to somehow push it out of consciousness, which is what evasion is. So you need to evade by adopting one or another rationalization for your belief. For example, you can evade that you really do accept altruism. You can say, I'm not really negating myself. Think back to Onkar's example in the lecture just the other day about how religious morality is usually comes along with a belief in the afterlife. And yeah, I'm sacrificing myself in this world, but I'm going to get a nice reward in the afterlife. That's exactly the kind of evasion that serves this need for self-esteem that Onkar was talking about. Or, how could you evade the second point to bring that out of consciousness? You could tell yourself, yeah, self-negation isn't really that bad. I'm not really destroying myself. And that, of course, if you understand what altruism actually demands and the way it works in the world, that amounts to an evasion of reality. We'll come back to examples of this in the COVID pandemic that I think vividly illustrate the forms of evasion in just a minute. But before we do that, I do want to just read one more passage from Galt's section here to bring out just how bad this evasion resulting from that dependency on altruism can be, and what triggers it, which is very interesting. Because he says, every form of causeless self-doubt, every feeling of inferiority and secret unworthiness is in fact man's hidden dread of his inability to deal with existence. The greater his terror, the more fiercely he clings to the murderous doctrines that choke him. So is it so coincidental that when you're in a crisis, when you are faced by an unprecedented pandemic, a novel virus that nobody understands, nobody knows where it came from, nobody knows what it's going to do to you, that therefore you should start to question your efficacy And you might, in that moment, think, well, yeah, I might not be able of living, but at least I'm worthy of living because I can live according to this morality that tells me I'm a good little boy if I sacrifice myself. And he goes on, no man can survive the moment of pronouncing himself irredeemably evil should he do it the next moment is insanity or suicide. Think James Taggart at the end of Atlas. To escape it, if he's chosen an irrational standard, he will fake, evade, blank out. He will cheat himself of reality, of existence, of happiness, of mind. He will ultimately cheat himself of self-esteem, of real self-esteem, by struggling to preserve its illusion rather than to risk discovering its lack. Okay. So with that in mind, with some better understanding of the psychology at work here, let's go back to our case study. Where do we see the exact same kind of evasion in the COVID pandemic? Now, I've already talked about some of the evasion that was engaged in by the left. They had to abandon all of those plans that they had, all the pre-pandemic science that said lockdowns are not going to work. And it wasn't only that. Arguably, they were also evading science, and a very important science, the science of philosophy, that no matter how much medical science you had, the big question is, philosophically, can you justify a government policy that violates individual rights? And of course, they didn't even want to think about whether there was an alternative to the moral code of altruism that would say, yes, that's justified. But I don't want to focus on the evasion of the left here, which I think is just too obvious, too well remembered. Instead, I actually want to focus on the evasion among the Republicans, on the right. Because remember, I'd asked this question: what happens in the mind of a person who thinks of himself, portrays himself as a defender of the land of the free and the home of the brave, but then is shamed into altruism? We now have some theoretical understanding of what might happen in the mind of such a person. We know they're going to have to evade that contradiction that they hold somehow. And this is exactly what we can see the Republicans did during, or at least many Republicans did during the pandemic. First, they did the first thing I mentioned. They evaded the fact that they even practiced it. This is why I had to spend so much time documenting to you the fact that, yes, there were a lot of Republicans doing COVID lockdowns because they've worked very hard to stop you from remembering it. Ron DeSantis, in his campaign book for 2023-24, has a whole chapter on how he handled COVID in Florida. And most of the chapter is about how he was a rebel, how Florida was freer, how we should export that freedom to the rest of the world. He almost barely even mentions the fact that he himself imposed a lockdown on Florida. It only comes up in passing to say that they lifted it earlier, not mentioning who it was who imposed it in the first place. Or how about President Trump, the one who was pressuring DeSantis to impose that lockdown at the behest of others because he himself was afraid about the Imperial College model? Well, in August 23, as a campaign video, saying, to every COVID tyrant who wants to take away our freedom, hear these words, we will not comply, saying in that video that the Democrats wanted to bring back COVID lockdowns, the very lockdowns that he had pressured them to impose. That's evasion. That's evasion, and even if they know it in their own mind, they certainly want to help other people evade that they were the ones who were also responsible. Here's another version of evading the fact that it's altruism that you're practicing, evading what its requirements are. There's a very interesting case study of this that happened in Texas. Some of you may remember Shelley Luther. She was the woman who ran a salon in North Texas, and she wanted to reopen, I think very justifiably and courageously, I think. She actually reopened in defiance of Governor Abbott's lockdowns. And of course, then she was taken to court, and she was held in contempt of court for refusing to comply, and the judge sentenced her to 7 days in jail, and in his speech from the bench said she was selfish. And what did she say in response? She said, I have to disagree with you, sir, when you say I'm selfish, because feeding my kids is not selfish. Well, I think I know why you're chuckling, right? Because in fact it is. That your children, your loved ones, are of supreme selfish value to you, and wanting to help them out is actually a good thing because it's selfish. But she doesn't want to acknowledge that. She wants to have her cake and eat it too. She wants to be able to resist the demands of self-sacrifice without saying that she's rejecting the morality of self-sacrifice. There was a similar interesting response by Republican governors in this period. Governor Abbott mused publicly about pardoning Shelley Luther. He didn't muse about withdrawing the lockdown that she was violating. The Supreme Court then pardoned her or dismissed her sentence without giving any reason. There was no written opinion. About a year later, when there was an opinion written, they justified their decision by basically excusing her on a technicality, that the judge who wrote the sentence didn't name the law that Shelley Luther had broken. Everybody knew which executive order she was breaking. That's why she was in jail. So she gets out on a technicality. These politicians did not want to acknowledge the demands for sacrifice that they themselves had imposed. But I would be remiss if I didn't discuss what I take to be the most egregious form of evasion that happened on the right post-COVID, and that was the whole host of anti-intellectual, arbitrary conspiracy claims that circulated about medical science. Now, don't get me wrong. My point is not that the scientists never make mistakes or that they're always honest or that nobody ever has a right to criticize some scientific finding. But medical science is one of the best established sciences in Western civilization, and many of us owe our lives to it. But these kooks would rather evade medical science than challenge the morality of altruism. And so that's why they evaded the danger of COVID itself, thinking, oh, it's just going to be like the flu, or maybe it's bad, but it comes from 5G networks. It's why they evaded the ineffectiveness of various quack treatments. You may remember ivermectin. It's why they evaded the benefits of the best proven protection that we ever have against any kind of virus, which is not a lockdown, it's a vaccine. They would rather evade those things than evade the morality that they were raised on. They were, in effect, operating on the premise of COVID better not be real, it better not be dangerous, or the treatment for it better be easy, otherwise I have to sacrifice my freedoms. That's the depth of the evasion that altruism generates. And here, to step back a moment from COVID and to look at the broader state of the right, it should be clear, this is precisely parallel to the right's more general attitude toward free markets and capitalism. Traditionally, when they tried to defend it, what they would do is, in effect, say, it's the people's capitalism. Free markets, they help the poor, they deliver the greatest good. They're not selfish, they're actually selfless. Here's what Ayn Rand had to say about that attitude in her essay, Conservatism, an Obituary. Conservatives are paralyzed by the profound conflict between capitalism and the moral code which dominates our culture, the morality of altruism. Not daring to challenge the morality of altruism, the conservatives have been struggling to evade the issue of morality or to bypass it. This has cost them their confidence, their courage, and their cause. Observe the guilty evasiveness, the apologetic timidity, the peculiarly non-intellectual, non-philosophical attitude projected by most conservatives in their speeches and their writings. That's what we're talking about. Now that she wrote in 1962. Is it any wonder that since then the right has moved further and further away from its one-time erstwhile defense of free markets and capitalism and now is barely distinguishable from the Democrats on issues of economic policy? There are other examples I could give here. Don't have time. If you want, ask in the Q&A about how the same issue comes up in other issues like foreign policy or election denial. But I want to leave you today with some, in effect, practical advice. Because the question we now face is, if that's what we're up against, if we're up against altruism that's so deeply psychologically entrenched that even the people who think of themselves as defenders of America are defensive about it, we're up against a lot. How do we break free from it? How do we not just, and I say we for a reason, because it's not just about encouraging other people to break free from it. It's about having the courage to break free from it ourselves. Because altruism's been around for 2,000 years. Judeo-Christian morality has had an effect everywhere on everybody. It is virtually impossible to escape its influence, even if you're a defender of America, of individualism, even if you're a fan of Ayn Rand. That's the real mind virus that we need to be inoculated against. So an essentially important part of a moral revolution is going to also consist of a kind of psychological revolution. And Ayn Rand saw it that way herself. She said, "For a nation, as for a man, a declaration of independence implies a declaration of self-esteem. Neither can stand without the other." Now that pushes the problem back just one level. How do you have a declaration of self-esteem? You can't just wake up in the morning and say, "I'm going to have self-esteem," precisely because it's not something that can be faked. It's something that you have to earn. How do you earn it such that you can have a moral revolution against this kind of enemy? And someone once asked Ayn Rand a similar question in a Q&A period after one of her versions of Faith and Force. In the early 1960s. They, in fact, asked her, in your novels, in Atlas Shrugged, your heroes can escape to a valley and go on strike. We don't have a valley, so what can we do? What can we do to make our society that we live in better? And she said, first of all, don't take the book literally. There is no valley, but there is still a way in which you can go on strike. And I want to read to you her answer. She said, "Break all cultural relationships, meaning withdraw your sanction from those people, groups, schools, or theories which preach the ideas that are destroying you. Stand on your own, use your own mind, check your premises, define your convictions, define them rationally. Do not take anyone on faith, and do not believe that your elders know what they are doing, because they don't. You have to be responsible creators. You have to be responsible creators of a new culture. If there is to be a new culture, break with altruism and with every idea that is based on it. Every idea that is based on it." So part of what she's saying here, and perhaps it should go without saying, that a moral declaration of independence is going to require a fair bit of independent thinking. So this is not something that can be centrally planned. As she put it, each of us has to work to create a new culture. Now, that doesn't mean we can't give any advice, and I'd like to try to do that. And I'd like to do it by giving you an example of at least some independent thinking I did for myself to take very seriously the idea of breaking with every idea that is based on altruism, even the ones that might look like they come from our allies, that might be used to criticize the enemies who preach altruism. So consider the following example. Here's a tweet from the libertarian group Students for Liberty. They've got a picture of Greta Thunberg, the renowned environmentalist activist. And, everybody likes to hate Greta. Notice the pattern. Environmental activism has become about feeling good, not doing good. It's about virtue signaling, not actual results. It's about emotional satisfaction, not rational solutions. Have you heard this phrase, virtue signaling, circulating a lot lately, especially used to criticize people on the left, the so-called woke? Have you been tempted to use this phrase to criticize them yourself? Well, that's the kind of example where you see a new phrase coming up in the culture, and you should think about, what does it mean? What is it being used to do? Should I accept it? And one question should always come up is, it's a new phrase. Are there any old ones that will do just as well? So if the problem is there are these people who are insincere, they're posturing, they are slacktivists who talk big but don't do anything. Well, why not call them just those things? Maybe they're hypocrites. Why call them virtue signalers? And especially, why call someone like Greta Thunberg a virtue signaler? I mean, if anybody practices what she preaches, it's Greta. The young lady doesn't want to take an airplane anywhere. She goes in boats around the world to go to various environmental protests. So it's strange to call her just a virtue signaler. But notice also a couple of things that this phrase, used as a pejorative, which it usually is, implies. It implies, yeah, the problem is it's only signaling. If they really were to act on what they take to be virtuous, if they really were to do good, then they'd be good. Do we really want people to act on Greta's advice on what she regards as the good? Is the problem that they're not acting on it? Or is the problem with what they regard as virtuous? They want to sacrifice our very standard of living for intangible environmental benefits that will benefit no human beings for many generations, if any at all. Is that the problem with it? It's just signaling? Or another implication of the pejorative use of virtue signaling, it suggests that it's arrogant to announce your virtue, even if you have it. So, question for you. Which idea about virtue implies or suggests or is the kind that people, for example, are very afraid to challenge? They want to say, oh, you're not living up to your standard. Very nice theory, bad practice. Which idea of virtue is that? Or which idea of virtue says that pride in one's own virtue is a sin? It is, of course, humility, self-sacrifice, altruism. And I maintain that this pejorative use of virtue signaling depends on an unacknowledged acceptance of the idea of altruism. They're afraid to challenge the very concept of virtue that the egalitarians, the environmentalists, etc., various forms of altruism stand for. Instead, they'd like to accuse them of being hypocrites or of confusing theory with practice or some such. There are many other ideas like this that circulate in our culture, even and especially on the right, that I think depend on altruism in the same way. I was even using a few of them in setting this up, so ask me more about these if you're interested. But humility, which is offered as the alternative to virtue signaling. The very fact we call them the woke movement, why don't we call them something else? What do they practice? Their ideology is utopian. Independent thinkers will look at these neologisms and think, do I really need this concept? Well, what's it covering up? What's it actually doing for me? So declaring moral independence really does require independent thinking. But I want to return now to wrap up to the question of virtue signaling, not any longer as an example of a concept that's dependent on altruism that we should think independently and perhaps reevaluate, but to just think about the very concept of signaling our virtue. The idea of treating that as a pejorative suggests we shouldn't. But if we really have virtue, shouldn't we want the world to know about that? Isn't self-esteem precisely recognizing the virtue that we do have and in appropriate circumstances telling other people about that? You know, objectivism places a great deal of importance on the issue of pronouncing moral judgment, that when your silence could be construed as agreement with an attack on your values, you should express disagreement. Sometimes you should pronounce moral judgment to other people. And it's important that the reason that objectivism maintains that is not because we're on some kind of crusade to save souls, because that would be the altruistic conception. No, the reason that we have this view is fundamentally a selfish view, that moral judgment is a selfish value, that when you judge another person, you're saying something about your own values, standing up for your own values, and telling other people, in effect, about your virtue, because that keeps your values real to you. It tells you, it gives you a way of reinforcing that these values mean something to you. They're not just formulas that you recite. They're things you live on. They're things you're willing to stand up for. Well, what is a declaration of self-esteem but declaring your virtue, which is signaling it? What do you think Galt is doing in his speech when he says things like this? Are you beginning to see who is John Galt? I am the man who's earned the thing you did not fight for, the thing you've renounced, betrayed, corrupted, yet were unable fully to destroy and are now hiding as your guilty secret, spending your life in apologies to every professional cannibal, lest it be discovered that somewhere within you still long to say what I am now saying to the hearing of the whole of mankind. I am proud of my own value and of the fact that I wish to live. John Galt's virtue signaling. He does it for 90 minutes. That's what it means to declare self-esteem. That's what it means to declare moral independence. And that's what Ayn Rand herself did when she wrote Atlas Shrugged. Because someone who writes a novel doesn't just write up an impersonal message to the world. She bears her soul to the world. She tells you something about who she is. And she herself reflected on this. And I will close with this. She wrote this in her essay, The Goal of My Writing. She said, "It's a significant commentary on the present state of our culture that I have become famous and also have become the object of hatred, smears, denunciations, as virtually the only novelist who has declared that her soul is not a sewer, and neither are the souls of her characters, and neither is the soul of man. And if anyone should ask me, what is it that I have said to the glory of man, I will answer only by paraphrasing Howard Rourke. I will say, hold up a copy of Atlas Shrugged and say, the explanation rests." That's what it looks like to declare moral independence. That's what the beginning of a moral revolution looks like. That kind of virtue signaling is what we all each need to find ways to do in our own lives. Thank you, and happy Independence Day. Okay, bit of a cue here. Yes. Jack.
I didn't quite get whether the Students for Liberty were promoting Greta Thunberg or not.
No, they were criticizing her. They're saying she's a virtue signaler.
Okay, well then I can keep donating.
Hey Ben, splendid talk. I wanted to ask you on the role of altruism on foreign policy and election denial.
Thanks for taking my plant. Yeah, if you saw the program notes for this, I was originally going to do 2 case studies, COVID and foreign policy. Just practically I couldn't fit it all in. Plus, Ankar already said a lot about foreign policy in his talk. I'll say just a little bit here about both of those things. Ankar already talked about how the reliance on altruism was so palpable during our response to 9/11, especially during the Iraq War, all the different ways in which American troops were sacrificed through rules of engagement, through having to go to the UN, because the whole thing was fought on the premise of we're not trying to do this for America's interests, we're doing it to free Iraq, to spread democracy, to remove weapons of mass destruction from the Middle East. You've seen the same kind of evasion of that fact in recent years. There's a whole generation of Iraq War veterans who are now in political leadership. Major examples include Tulsi Gabbard, J.D. Vance, Pete Hegseth. In one way or another, you see the same evasion because they're very anti-war. I mean, they had to be dragged kicking and screaming into the very limited engagement we had with Iran a couple of weeks ago, largely because of their general anti-war sentiment. Why are they so anti-war? Well, if you look, for example, at Pete Hegseth's book, he wrote this book, The War on Warriors, which is actually very interesting in a number of ways, because he was on the ground in the special forces in Iraq during the war, and he saw the impact of these rules of engagement on his own troops. when they had to release Al-Qaeda operatives into the population because of what the lawyers were telling them. And on a kind of gut level, Hegseth knows this is wrong, but he has no way to articulate the alternative. He brings up just war theory to say, yeah, God sometimes wants us to fight wars. Of course, it was just war theory that was used to justify the altruistic war that we fought. He doesn't have any arguments for why it should have been interpreted differently than it was. It was interpreted to say, no, you have to have a proportionate response, you can't target civilians, et cetera, et cetera. And he says very interesting things about how, I mean, in effect, what he ends up saying is, well, that's good in theory. In practice, we have to write our own rules. We can't all be moral. So this dichotomy between the practical and the moral, between the theoretical and the practical, the realistic and the idealistic, is very, very entrenched in Hegseth. And that's a real evasion. Rather than challenging the theory that there was something wrong with just war theory and altruism in the first place, he'd rather say, well, people weren't being practical. We need to write our own pragmatic rules. There's a lot more to say about foreign policy, but I'll say something quickly about election denial. I think, and it's difficult to prove, but I think that a good amount of what went into the fiasco in 2020 and the people going to the Capitol on January 6th, why do they find it so hard to believe they might have lost, that their guy might have lost an election? Why do they find it so hard to believe that the majority might just disagree with them? I mean, when you characterize how evil and awful the left is, isn't part of the threat that they are many and legion and coming for us? So why is it so surprising that they might actually win the election? Is it perhaps because they thought, God, it can't be that the majority of people disagree with me, because if they do, then I wouldn't have a right to object. I wouldn't have a right to speak up for myself and say they were wrong, even though they're in the majority. So I think it was the same kind of evasion.
Okay, thank you, Ben.
I have a general question on altruism. How do we fight the package deal that self-sacrifice is selfish?
That self-sacrifice is selfish? Do you mean the issue that Ankar talked about the other day about, say, Christian altruism being rewarded in the afterlife?
Or just saying that, you do something for somebody else, it'll make you feel better.
Well, that's the argument that usually goes into what they call psychological egoism, the idea that really everybody is selfish, even the Mother Teresa's. And the first thing to say, of course, is that the mere fact that it makes you feel better doesn't establish that it's actually selfish. Because whether you achieve self-interest or not is not simply a matter of how you happen to be feeling. And the people who feel good when they engage in an altruistic act wouldn't feel that way unless they believed they really were giving something up. So selfishness is not a default setting. It's something that is a rare achievement. It's not the case that everybody is selfish. The fact that they feel good about what they do doesn't prove that, and they don't usually feel that good. That's part of what my whole talk has been about. It is not good. It's not a good feeling to be evasive and defensive. At best, what you can get from acting as an altruist is a temporary relief from pain, from struggling with your own insecurities, but the absence of a negative is not a positive. That is not self-interest. Yes?
As someone who had a teenager in 10th grade when the shutdown happened and I saw the psychological damage to my son, which I could write a book about, but and I'm also a tutor, so I see it in many, many children, even still to this day. But I did think there was a dot of goodness that came out of the shutdown, which was when the kids were home and doing virtual school, and my son didn't wear headphones, so it would just, the sound would come out and I could hear what the teachers were saying and teaching, which was, it was a public school, and it was shocking and gave me so little respect for what was going on in there. However, and so, everybody flocked to the private schools, including Catholic schools, partly because they weren't shut down and they just wanted them to be in there. But then came the backlash of, oh my God, what's being taught? And how are these teachers speaking? And the vocabulary they're mispronouncing and all those sorts of things. But I don't hear that anymore. And I'm wondering if you think there was good stuff that came out of that.
Do you mean you don't hear the reflection on the state of our educational system that you did during COVID?
Correct.
Education policy is not really my field of expertise. I don't know if but I would say I think there has been post-pandemic reflection. There's been a whole movement to create alternative schools and private schools. We have a lot of that in Texas. There's a lot of different people trying different solutions. There's different state-level policies that have made that easier to do. We just released a podcast about this at ARI recently about the school choice movement. It's probably not the best possible reform you could have, but it's perhaps a step in a better direction. Not really my subject, but I think there has been at least a little bit of movement in that direction. Certainly we could use more.
Thank you.
That's okay. Thank you so much, Ben. I'm all smiles. I love your talk. It's brilliant. So I wanted to touch on, you mentioned the idea of virtue signaling in terms of expressing what you're proud of in yourself, the virtues that you use in your daily life, to even coworkers, to your family, to your friends. And I want to take that step further because something that my husband Robert Nacer and I have been doing for a while is we try, or at least with my coworkers and our friends at Great Lakes Objectivists, we try to point out what their virtues are. If I see a virtue in somebody, if I see somebody being honest, being integrated, being productive, I point that out to them. I give them the words. And it's always been fun to do that at work. People are kind of surprised, and it's really fun to do that with my non-objectivist friends. So I just wanted to take that a little further. Thanks for Galt speech, the Galt speech breakdown. I'll be using that to probably study Galt's speech a little bit better in our group. And I also want to just end with one of my favorite quotes from Leonard Peikoff, which is, "The first duty of justice is to acknowledge and praise the good."
Yes.
So,
justice is primarily about love for the good. And so it's really important not just to signal your own virtue, but to identify it in others. And how are you going to do that unless they signal it in some way or another? Now, of course, you sometimes, too often, need to call out what's bad in the world. But when you do it in the right way, it's motivated by the values that are under attack that you are trying to defend. We did a podcast on this subject some time ago at ARI called "Why Are Objectivists So Negative?" Well, it's not out of a motivation by fear. It is motivation by love for the values that are being attacked. And I should mention, since you mentioned the outline, that little very bare-bones 5-point outline that I gave to you was inspired in good part by the really excellent outline that Greg Salmieri did, which is reprinted in the back of the Robert Mayhew Essays on Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, which is much more detailed, but basically broken down into those 5 same portions, which I sort of renamed for purposes here. So check it out.
Great talk. Thank you, Ben. So my question is, suppose the pandemic turned out to be many more deaths, let's say even 20% of the population. Can you think of an instance that the proper role of government would be to shut down the economy? Because I can't think of one.
I have a hard time thinking of one that would justify, like I said, sweeping statewide and national lockdowns. Now, I did also say, there can be a proper role for government in quarantine. And I could even imagine, I don't know, I'd have to look at the data more carefully, that you could justify maybe shutting down a part of a city where there's a rapid spread, like kind of what happened in the early stages of the pandemic in New York. You all saw those pictures from Elmhurst Hospital. But at the same time, it's also super important, and part of the reason why the lockdowns didn't happen in Sweden is because Sweden had a legal framework in place for dealing with this. It had defined standards according to which when you could justifiably have quarantine, when not. And it was all codified in law, and they had to adhere to it. This is one of the things that Onkar talks about in that paper, Pro-Freedom Approach to Infectious Disease. And so, I can imagine limited, well-defined, and specified quarantines that government could do justifiably, but you need to have a legal framework for it. And one of the things that's most concerning about the way the lockdowns happened in this country is there was usually, for the most part, no legal basis for them, or when there was, it was legal basis that was in some clause of some Emergency Powers Act that was set up in the Cold War, usually with the idea of like a Soviet invasion in mind, but was worded so ambiguously that it could be invoked in a period like this. And those are dramatically dangerous laws. We've seen so much abuse of emergency powers in the current administration. It's so at war with rule of law and with freedom. That's what we have to work against. We have to defend rule of law. We have to go to war with these emergency powers laws.
Thank you. Hey, great talk, Ben. I especially appreciated the innovative aspects of it. There's parts of it I had trouble understanding, though, and my question is it really the case that people are evading their reliance on altruism? It seems more like they're trying to act in accordance with it. It's the only moral code they're aware of. But at the same time, they don't want to commit suicide. And then as a result, they end up with contradictions. And it's the contradictions they then evade specifically. And not all of them do. I think, there's examples, mostly I can think of them in fiction of people, maybe that, a more individualistic hero kind of admitting, oh yeah, I'm a selfish bastard. You don't see any of that in the public. So it seems like it's not that they evade their reliance on altruism, they evade the specific contradictions that leads to.
Well, I think that evading that you rely on it is one way you might evade the contradiction. It's not the only way. And I should say, I don't think that everybody who is somehow in the grips of altruism is necessarily evading that fact. So you mentioned someone thinking, yeah, I'm a selfish bastard, make the most of it. And this is sort of the position of Hank Rearden, Atlas Shrugged. I don't think Rearden's evading it, though. I don't think he's evading the big question.
Point. Yeah, those people aren't evading.
No,
yeah.
No. They don't have an alternative. You're not given an alternative. You're not born with it. You don't know what the best other option is going to be besides altruism.
Yeah.
And until you find one, you're just struggling, saying, yeah, I don't know what really to do. I guess this is okay. But the important thing about Rearden is that he is struggling, that he is trying to figure out what these ideas mean, where they come from, and whether there is an alternative. And the whole drama with Rearden is his interaction with Francisco teaching him, no, people have different moral codes. You've been given one, but there's alternatives, and yours is actually the code of life. It's the one to the extent to which you've lived on, that you've brought life to the world. What if you turned the code that you live in at work into your whole moral code? So, yes, Rearden has contradictions. He's under the influence of conventional morality in certain ways. He's definitely not evading. So my point is not that all these people are evading, but some of them definitely are.
But are they evading their reliance on altruism? It seems like everyone just agrees this is the moral code. The idea that there's an alternative simply isn't on their radar.
Well, that's where my Shelley Luther example comes in, because I think part of what it means to evade that you're relying on that code is to evade what its requirements are. Because if you really were just all completely self-consciously okay with this code, you wouldn't be compromising with it. You wouldn't be cheating on it. You'd think that's the wrong thing to do. And so to the extent that you do cheat but don't want to challenge the code, you've got to evade its nature and what it demands of you.
Okay, thank you.
Great talk. I certainly see that studying religion helps one to uproot Christianity from one's soul and achieve greater moral independence.
Sorry, what was it you said helps one achieve greater independence?
Studying religion.
Studying religion?
Yes.
Okay.
As you made these examples, that understanding how religion influences a person helps to uproot it, right? So
yes.
What other intellectual phenomena would you say it's worth studying for the specific purpose of achieving this positive value of achieving greater intellectual moral independence?
Well, there's a lot. I don't have a good list handy with me, but I mean, there's more to study about what the positive alternative of a morality of life really means, what it really requires of you. Ankar made a big point about how one of the failures of the Enlightenment was to form a proper conception of what self-interest even is. And so you get that caricature that I talked about. You get people blindly rebelling against sacrifice. He made a lot of the blind rebellion against the orgy of self-sacrifice, which is a failure to understand what it is you are rebelling against and for the sake of what you are rebelling. What we talked about today was a good example of that. So understand better the positive theory, understand better the motivation of the people who are trying to get you to sacrifice. I mean, half of the struggle that the characters in Atlas Shrugged engage in, Dagny and Reardon especially, is to understand the motivation of the preachers of altruism. I didn't talk so much about that in this talk, but that fourth section in Galt's speech, talking about why they're so evil, that's the point that Dagny and Reardon have to struggle to understand. And it relates to the issue that came up before about isn't everybody selfish? Dagny and Reardon, or at least Dagny, is sort of on that premise that everybody wants to live. I just need to show them that if they let me be free, I'll be able to produce, I'll be able to raise the level of prosperity and save the country, and they value production and prosperity, don't they? And so if I can show them that, then they will unshackle me. And of course, she discovers that the harder that she works, the more they double down on restraining her, and she doesn't understand it, and existence is beginning to look pointless to her. And she's losing her benevolent universe premise. But it's all because she's making this mistake of assuming that everybody actually does want to live, and it's only at the end of the book where she sees the reaction of people in the crowd to the look of John Galt's face when he's put on stage and being forced to speak, and she realizes that they're afraid of him, this man with the ideal face with no pain or fear or guilt that she loves. She realizes they do not have the same psychology as she does. They don't want to live, they want him to die. And so that is further to the point you have to understand the motivations of the leaders and the intellectual preachers of this morality, that they don't want to live, they're not selfish, and understanding that that's what you're really up against in the end, you have to call that out. Because if you don't, if you concede, if you play along with them, if you try to stay within their system and concede their ideas, you're then just helping them fake their own self-esteem. They need self-esteem too. They need to believe that they've duped you. And so a big part of the drama of Atlas Shrugged is recognizing not to deliver the sanction to the victim. Not only don't do it materially by continuing to give the looters your money and your business, but don't do it morally and intellectually, because what they need, the sanction they need from you especially, is the sanction of their ideas, all these ideas based on altruism, which when you accept, you validate them, you help them fake their consciousness and self-esteem. So there's a lot there to understand. It's a lot in Atlas Shrugged in Galt's speech that's not understood. I encourage closer reading of Atlas Shrugged.
I will, thank you.
Elio.
Hi, Dr. Bear. Thank you for your talk. I'd like you to elaborate on how the concept of woke is genetically dependent on altruism. It's just one of those things that I wasn't able to see.
It's not that it's dependent on it. So I flagged it as a concept that should be challenged and thought about. Why do they want to use that term? And think about, so the woke movement, broadly associated with Black Lives Matter, DEI, in the later part of the last decade, the name for it originally comes from a name they gave themselves, right? They called themselves woke because they were waking up to the oppression of the system, in effect. And then it started to be used as a pejorative. The woke say this. Just the same way as the right would pejoratively talk about hippies, who originally called themselves hippies. So one thing to think about is, well, why do we want to call them what they want to be called? Why use their own name? Now that they're doing it sarcastically, so it's supposed to be a self-conscious criticism and pejorative. But the bigger question in my mind is, why use it when you could use something else that actually identifies their nature? And this is a point that Greg Salmieri made to me, and it stuck with me, and it's very good, that what you should call them is what they are. They are egalitarians. And now, why don't people want to call them what they are, egalitarians? Well, if you say what the problem with that movement is that they want to have perfect equality of everybody. They want to drag everybody down to the lowest level, regardless of their levels of ability, just to seek some kind of nihilistic ideal. Why don't you want to do it? Because they don't want to challenge. You don't want to come across, I'm not against egalitarianism, I'm not against equality, I believe in brother love. So I think the fact that there's so much placed on having this kind of quick and dirty, name-call-y kind of pejorative is masking a reluctance to actually call a spade, what they actually are as egalitarians. If you ever call them woke, you can sometimes do that with scare quotes. I always use it with scare quotes, just to activate in people's minds, who I'm talking about. But having used the scare quotes, they need to be called out for their actual ideas.
Thank you.
Brilliant, powerful talk, Ben. Thank you. I take it as a rousing call for a new morality, for declaring independence, as you titled it, from altruism. Part of what you stressed was our need to detect, philosophical detection of various catchphrases, virtue signaling, and we're all in this together and so forth. It reminds me of Harry Binswanger's lecture, Consciousness Identification, which he starts by saying, when I first, I'm paraphrasing, when I first read Atlas Shrugged, I thought our revolution, or he didn't use this word, would be soon over. People would either be converted or they would commit suicide. But then he says, I was wrong. The battle that we face, the war we face, is not moral in the first place. It is conceptual, because we're facing anti-conceptual mentality. So my question is, do you agree that this war that you're calling for must be going in parallel with the conceptual war? Because if we're, arousing people, telling them we want this morality against this morality, egoism, altruism, people don't know what we're talking about. We need to explain them, this is what I mean, and concepts are not subjective. What are concepts? And so forth. So
yeah, nothing that I said I hope anyone will construe to mean that there isn't just a regular old-fashioned intellectual philosophical battle to be undertaken here. There is so much explanation of these concepts that's needed. That's what we need the new intellectuals to do. There is still so much, because of people's evasion of what altruism is and what it demands of us and how widespread it is, there's so much reluctance to even listen to the idea that someone like Ayn Rand had an alternative, and there's so much that we are trying to do at the Institute to break down those barriers. So yes, so much still to do. My point is really just that it's not all about explaining intellectual positions, is that it's also about having the courage to practice these ideas, to stand up for them by using them in your own life, and to do that especially keeping in mind that we are not immune from the altruistic mind virus from birth. We have to be vaccinated against it, and that vaccine requires lots of independent thinking. Objectivists are not immune to it either, just by being objectivists. I can tell you all kinds of examples of ways in which I still struggle with inherited Catholic guilt from my upbringing, and I did during the pandemic. I wasn't afraid of getting sick. I was definitely afraid of being seen as an evil person for standing up in favor of freedom, and it's something you just have to work on, and you have to acknowledge where it's coming from, that it's coming from your upbringing, it's coming from the culture that you're in. Unless you were raised on an island by objectivists who were never exposed to any of this horrific culture, you're going to have a hard time escaping from that influence, and so it's important to acknowledge it and work to uproot it wherever you may find it.
Thank you, Ben. Evil person. I'm one of the evil people that stood up. Linda Cordair.
Ah, yes. During the lockdown, your example was excellent.
Thank you. And this talk moved me deeply because it does hit really close to home. In late April of 2020, 6 weeks after the lockdown, my husband Quentin and I presented the state of California and the local government with our own written moral declaration of independence by declaring that we would open our gallery in spite of their lockdown orders. We were among the first people in the country to stand up against the arbitrary lockdowns, and we experienced firsthand the horrors of altruism that included death threats to ourselves, threats of fines, extremely large fines, and loss of people in our lives who we thought were dear and close friends. We were told things like, why didn't you check with us first? Why didn't you ask us first before you made this decision? It was crazy. All because we chose to open our business, a 3,600 square foot art gallery, while a neighboring small candy shop could open because they were essential. I still can't hear the word essential without cringing just a little bit. Your very informative talk today should be broadcast nationally to remind people how irrational and unconstitutional the COVID lockdowns were. We declared that we would take our lawsuit to the Supreme Court if necessary, and we would have. We owe an enormous amount of thanks to the Pacific Legal Foundation. I know Larry's here somewhere, for fighting beside us and helping us win that battle against California and subsequently a good part of the country. My question is, will your talk today be available for circulation and wide publication so that this altruistic atrocity never happens again?
We're live streaming right now, so it's going to be on YouTube. But, so definitely thank you. But I just want to say also thank you for sharing that story. I know about your case. You did exactly what Shelley Luther should have done, that more people should do, and it's an excellent example that there can be meaningful intellectual, practical activism that constitutes this kind of moral revolution in practice. So thank you for sharing. Thank you for what you did.
Thank you.
Everybody.